The new book, Land to Lots, written by Carter Froelich, is now available to purchase on Amazon. Get your copy of Land to Lots, How to Borrow Money You Don't Have to Pay Back, and launch master planned communities today. Welcome to the Land to Lots podcast, powered by Launch Development Finance Advisors. And now your host, Carter Froelich.
Hey guys, welcome to the Land to Lots podcast. This is Carter Froelich, and I'm very privileged to be before you again here today. Today's episode is going to relate to language that we can put in our agreements, primarily a development agreement, related to oversizing of infrastructure. And if we do have to oversize this infrastructure, how we are going to be reimbursed for that infrastructure and what we can do to either reduce, eliminate, or defer the oversizing. And if we do, in fact, have to oversize, how we can get paid back sooner rather than later. So when we're anticipating that we may be required at some point to oversize infrastructure, the first thing that I like to try to do as part of the development agreement is get the city to agree that our intent is to have you as the master developer first and only finance infrastructure that is specifically demanded by your project. Period. End of story. However, to the extent that we may have to oversize infrastructure, then we want to start laying out some guidelines and guideposts so that both parties, the city and the developer, know how this oversizing will be handled. I think it's important to also have the city recognize and agree that to the extent that we're building any public infrastructure, and we're having to post improvement security, performance bonds, completion bonds, etc., that the city will use its best efforts to allow us partial releases of those improvement security bonds as we build out the specific piece of infrastructure. That way we're able to reduce some of our costs of carry. And so here again, that's a real fairly simple add to the agreement as it relates to the infrastructure. Now, as it relates to the topic of oversizing, the one thing that I like to do in the agreements that we're involved is to put in a section, and the heading might be something to the fact that duty to avoid oversizing of public infrastructure. I mean, I call it out that the city must ensure that to the maximum extent possible that the developer will not be required to finance or construct any project, facilities, or infrastructure in excess of their fair share costs. And we can even tie fair share costs to legal requirements of essential nexus and rough proportionality. Now, those are all development impact fee language, but it all goes back to case law of Nolan and Dolan. But here again, if I don't have to oversize, that is going to help my project. And I want, to the best of my ability, to make sure that our clients are getting this language in the development agreement. Obviously, you'll get a lot of pushback from the cities when you start putting language like this in. But here again, if you don't ask for it, you're not going to get it. So I really encourage you to consider putting a section in that, the city must ensure that it's going to use its best abilities not to require this oversizing. And then if for some reason that we do have to do oversizing of infrastructure for whatever reason, that the city will allow us to construct only such increments or phases of this infrastructure that is needed for the project at the time, the development project is requiring this infrastructure. Therefore, I'm not having to put it all in up front, but I can incrementally add that oversizing over time. to the extent that the various facilities will allow us to do it. So, what does that mean? And to put it in perspective, if we are required, for instance, to build 4 lanes of a roadway, then if my project is not requiring 4 lanes day one, which it typically isn't, that I want the ability to just put in 2 lanes, so I have ingress and egress from the project, and when the level of service hits such a point that the traffic studies triggers an additional 2 lanes, that's when I'll build the additional 2 lanes. But here again, we've gone in with the expectation and the agreement that we're only going to be adding incremental infrastructure when it's required by the development. The second section is once we do get into the requirement or the need to oversize infrastructure, we're literally going to be setting up a mechanism and steps by how the oversizing costs are going to be determined and how they are going to get paid back. So there's a lot of different steps that we can lay out and we can discuss, but I think what I'm going to do is kind of just skip over how those incremental costs are determined. Obviously, this gets into a lot of engineering, and we'll leave that for another podcast. But the thing I think is important is to make sure that you do have a process and formulas and methodology laid out in the agreement so that all parties know how this oversizing will be determined. Moving into the next section of the agreement that I would suggest that you consider adding is participation of other property owners that may be benefiting from this infrastructure and or the establishment of reimbursement mechanisms. So that to the extent that the city is requiring the developer to oversize infrastructure, and here again, these are just project facilities that relate to our project, and we're incurring costs to pay for this oversizing, that the city must, keyword must, not shall think about it, but that the city will use good faith efforts to secure funding from other benefiting landowners. What does that mean? If we're funding infrastructure and we provide a written request to the city then must adopt or implement some sort of reimbursement mechanism to require these benefiting landowners to pay their pro rata share of the infrastructure. A lot of times this is done through a latecomer fee or a development impact fee, or there's other types of fees. But here again, this is the recognition on the part of the city that we as the developer are funding this infrastructure for the benefit of others, and that they are going to require these other benefiting parties to pay us sooner rather than later for this infrastructure. Now, I touched on the concept of sooner rather than later, and I've talked about this on other podcasts. A lot of times the city will let the benefiting landowner or the builder pay onesie twosies as they pull permits. What we like to try to do is put specific language into a reimbursement mechanism agreement or into the agreement that says once the benefiting landowner records a plat or pulls a construction permit, be that grading or what have you, that 100% of their fair share cost is due and payable at the occurrence of that very subjective event. That's a way for us to accelerate the cash into the pro forma and reimburse our developer clients for that infrastructure dollars that they've already put in. The other thing is that we want to be very specific on what we're going to get paid back for, meaning hard costs, soft costs, staking, permitting, all that kind of good stuff. But the other thing that I want to add in there is financing costs, and I will always add financing costs, and I will try to make it our actual financing cost. So if we're borrowing money at 14%, I want to make sure we're getting paid back 14%. A lot of times most of the times the cities are going to push back on that. But here again, we're setting a fairly high bar, but it's a realistic bar because that's actually what we're paying back. So that is one thing that you'll want to consider. The other thing that we write into oversizing agreements is the fact that we have the ability to form one or more multiple special purpose taxing districts. So, and we do this as a matter of course, but here again, we're bringing it back into this section as well, saying that the districts will only be paying their pro rata share of the infrastructure, and any oversizing that's required, that oversizing amount will not be paid by the district, but it will be reimbursed through these various different reimbursement mechanisms that the city is going to be setting up. As it relates to if we're not able to get 100% of the monies flowing into us at the occurrence of an objectable event, meaning the benefiting landowners' pro rata share of the oversizing, we want to make sure at a minimum that the city is reimbursing us on a monthly basis on a quarterly basis for all the fees that they collected over the previous 3-month period. Other items that we may want to add is to the extent that we're having to do dedications for infrastructure, that we only want to dedicate the land when it's actually needed for the facilities. Who knows, plans may change in the future, so let's just dedicate it when we need to dedicate it. And then I want to carve out the ability to get reimbursed for our pro rata share of the land that relates to any type of oversizing, if we're able to do that. And then secondly, I also want to use the real property interests, be them offsite easements, offsite dedications, or rights of way that have to be acquired, but I want to set those up as eligible for financing through the special districts that we're setting up and the reimbursement, other reimbursement mechanisms. Speaking of offsite infrastructure, we really want to nail down the city that they must cooperate with the developer and take all actions necessary to make sure that they're obtaining the rights of way. So in other words, they're diligently and timely going to be executing the city's power of eminent domain to make sure that we have those easements, those rights of way when we need them, so that we're not experiencing any construction delays, laying pipe, getting utility services to our project. So those are some of the primary things that I would encourage you to think about as it relates to some of the more common issues that come up in oversizing of infrastructure. And to recap, the first thing we want to do is try to make sure that that we don't have to do any oversizing. If we do have to do oversizing, the first entity we want to pay for that oversizing is the city. Hey, city, you pay for the oversizing, you pay the difference. And if not, then we want to set up different mechanisms whereby if we have to fund it, we can get repaid. And then try to get repaid sooner rather than later. And all of that is set up by memorializing the understanding of the parties in the development agreement. And here again, these are just sections of a larger agreement that deal with all the entitlements and the conditions of approval, but these are critical as it's a way for us to begin to financially engineer the returns on our project. That concludes today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you found this information helpful, please pass it on to your colleagues and subscribe to the Land to Lots podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And look forward to speaking with you again on our next episode of Land to Lots.
You have been listening to the Land to Lots podcast with Carter Froelich. Follow us wherever you find your podcasts to never miss a new episode.